Okay, in this video, this is very similar to the first video I had set up where we had access to cross-origin resource. However, now we're going to combine this with using basic authentication as well, which is something we're also going to commonly want to do. Now, what we are going to have here in our dependencies, in order to enable Spring security, we need to add the Spring Boot Starter Security dependency, and I did add the test dependency as well. And this will give us support for Spring Security. Now, we haven't set anything up, so what we're going to do is we are going to go into the application.yml, and we're going to set up just one thing is all we need to set up. We're going to do security, basic enabled, and set it to true. And instead of having a randomly generated username and password, we're going to say user name equals user1, so we know what the user is, and the password is change me. Now again, this isn't what we would normally do in production, but we're using this as an example to show you how to set up basic authentication. Now, to do this now, if we go back to our site, and we've already have Spring Boot up and running, and we run this, now we're going to be prompted for a username and password, and we're not going to use that username and password right now, so we get a 401 unauthorized for this specific page. Now, from this example, I'm not going to pull up the index page from the same origin, remember, because if I go to 8080 as here, let's look at this. If we go to 8080 and do index.html, we're being asked to put in credentials for basic authentication, which is, of course, exactly what we need to do. However, what we're trying to assume here, we're trying to view this as a cross origin. So we're going to go and we're going to open this up separately. Now, if we open this here, what we see is we get an error. Now, in Chrome, we're going to do Alt-Command-I, so we get the developer console up, and let's look at what the actual problem is here. Now, here is what the problem says, and we look at the second one, and don't get confused by this because it says that there's no access control allow origin header present. I mean, true, but the reason that header is not present is because we have gotten a 401 error, meaning that we have not authenticated ourselves to this specific URI in port 8080/API. That's the real problem here. We don't have authentication within our Ajax page. So let's actually go do that now. Okay, so what we need to do in jQuery is we need to add a specific section here. Now let's look at this section. We're going to add before send. We're going to have this function, and our XRH is going to set the request headers, and what we need to set is authorization, and that authorization is going to be basic authentication, and we use a jQuery function called BTOA with the username : password, and this will add the specific authentication headers being sent in the request so that we can actually be successfully authenticated. Now that we've added this authentication or basic authentication, remember, let's start this from another origin. Let's open this up and let's see what happens. Oh, we get an error. Wow, okay. Well, let's go back to our console and let's look at what the specific error actually states. Now, well, it's actually something a little bit different now, right? The server failed to respond with a status of, again, 401. Has nothing to do with our headers anymore, but it does have something very specific. It says, Response for pre-flight has invalid HTTP status code 401. This isn't even talking about missing headers. This is talking about pre-flight. So very interesting. So what's going on here? It's kind of confusing as far as what's going on with pre-flight. And let me show you, it's kind of tricky. Once you know it, it's going to be a little bit more specific, but let's look at what the problem is. Now, I'm going to start up another tool to actually help us debug this before we go any further. Now, a tool that I'm going to use right now for my debugging is called TCPmon, and it's actually at this URL. This URL has been pasted into this YouTube video so you can get access to it. This same plugin is also available in Eclipse, and it's a pretty cool tool, and what it's going to do is it's going to do this. It's actually going to run an application, and the application is going to look like this, okay? So it is really just intercepting requests, and this is just one way for us to do some testing. Now, let me show you what I'm going to do. So what I'd like to do is, let's say we're going to listen for requests on port 9999, and then we're going to relay them over to port 8888. Now remember, not 8888, right? We want to do 8080, sorry. Our API is listening on port 8080. And what we're going to do is we're going to add this here. Now, if you notice, we get a new tab here, and what it's looking like is this. It's going to be listening for port 9999, and it's going to broker it back to port 8080. So going back over to here, let's change one thing, okay? Now, currently, we're trying to access our page via 8080 API. So let's change that, 9999. So for 9999, now we're going to be going through this TCPmon for all of our requests. Now, I didn't change anything else because I want you to see what's happening here, because there's something very peculiar happening when we're trying to make this request. So let's restart this again for a cross origin, start this up again. We still get an error. Okay, and that's fine. So if I open up my console, I'm still getting my 401 exception here, right? Nothing's changed, right? But I still was able to access this. Now here's where the change comes. Let's go look at this. Now, we actually had a request. Now, look at what the request actually was. The request was for localhost, but here's what's very important. This was an options request, not a GET request. We didn't make the GET request yet. What happened was we made, and if you see here, this is why I love this tool. This tool can actually help us look at what we're trying to access, and looking at this little by little. Let's scroll down one at a time. Here we go. And let's look at first just the different request headers that were sent, okay? We sent an options request to API, and it's at localhost 9999. That's what we assumed. We're running localhost 63.342 as where this page was executing. And when we actually try to execute this, we're, again, not making a GET request. We're making an options request first. And for the options request, here's what's actually interesting about it. The options request, we don't need all of this actually, because there's really kind of a problem with it. Now, if you notice here, we're making an HTTP request, and it is scrolling down here, right? We actually have basic authentication enabled, and we do have our headers. Our headers have already been set. We have all these access control headers. But notice here, we still get a 401. Well, we get a 401 because we're trying to make what's known as a pre-flight request. So what happens is jQuery is going to make kind of a ping to an options before it actually makes the actual GET request. So the initial request is not correct at all. It's not hitting the correct, it's basically making a request that is still not authenticated, even though we have authentication headers set, which is right here. We actually set these headers, but this is for our GET request, right? We don't have it for the correct request. Now, I'll show you one other thing before I go somewhere else. Let's actually make another change here, right? Let me show you. I'm just going to do this as an example. If I was to do, remember, if I was to put in the credentials, we can prove that there's a problem with the options because our user1 : change me at localhost 8080, right, happens to be the specific way to actually access this via sending our basic authentication credentials. So let's verify this, right? Let's actually go and let's set this. Look, we were able to get through that, actually accessing that API with the actual credentials automatically for us without having a problem. So again, this isn't a GET problem. This happens to be an options problem. Okay, in order to fix our problem, here's what our problem actually is. We need to add a security configuration to allow these pre-flight requests. So individually, let's look at this line by line. First of all, I'm just going to create, notice there's no other annotations here. I'm just creating a security config. This is extending the web security configure adapter, and it's only using the @configuration annotation. No other annotations. We don't need anything else. Now we're going to override only one method, and specifically it is the configure method taking HTTP security. Now again, here's what the issue is. There is a pre-flight request that is an HTTP options request, and we're not allowing for options to be made without credentials. Now, we don't need this, there to be actually credentials for our options. It's only going to say, can I make this request with the correct headers? So we're going to set up and we're going to ignore the HTTP options. So we're going to do an http.authorize request, and ant matchers, we're looking for anything that is an HTTP method.options, only options. And if it is options, we're looking for this options to be any kind of request at all, /*, or we could have done API, for example, as well, because that was our endpoint. And we're just going to say we would like to permit all. Okay. Now let's go back to our basic page and let's try to make this request again. Let's see what happens. Okay, we still get another error. Now, when we open this up and we look at the error that we are actually finding here, here's the problem is. The request header field authorization is not allowed by access control allow headers in a pre-flight response. Okay. Well, it sounds weird, but you know what? It's actually not that weird. What the problem specifically is for this is that we have a problem with our CORS filter. So going back to our CORS filter here, and I'm going to do this. I'm going to print out. This is the exception we actually got. So let's look at what's actually happening here. What's happening is that when we're making this request, this access control allow header setting it to asterisk is not valid when we're talking about authentication. We actually have to be specific and actually add the header. Now I've added all the ones that are very common for what we need. So all we need to do is we need to not have the asterisk and be specific about the ones we want. Now, the reason with this is that the authorization header is how our client sends the authorization token to say, I'd like to be authorized, and I'm going to be using basic authentication. So by actually being specific with these headers, of course, let's just restart this and assume that now we've got our new CORS headers in place. Going back here, let's look at this again, and look, we actually get the correct value coming back at this point through basic authentication. And looking at our console is describing everything successfully. We've got the object back, which is a string. It was successful, and the data was hello world. Now, this has been a tutorial showing you how to access cross-origin resources while you're still using basic authentication. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you like that, please subscribe to my channel and see all the latest videos that I have coming out. Thanks a lot.